The pen hovered above the parchment for what felt like an eternity, and in that suspended moment, the weight of an entire monarchy rested on the trembling hand of a king who had spent his entire life preparing for duty, but never for this devastating choice, because King Charles stared at the decree that would permanently sever his younger son from the institution he was born to serve. And the silence in that room was so complete that the monarch could hear his own heartbeat as he struggled to reconcile the love of a father with the responsibilities of a sovereign. And when his hand finally moved, the signature that touched that page did not simply remove a title or withdraw a privilege. It fundamentally reshaped the British monarchy in ways that would reverberate across continents and generations, because this was not a temporary suspension or a gentle warning. It was a final and irreversible declaration that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex would no longer be recognized as working members of the royal family, and the emotional devastation that followed began before the ink had even dried, as two senior advisors stood in complete silence, their faces betraying nothing, but their eyes revealing the gravity of what had just transpired. And Charles did not release the pen immediately because he understood that once his name was affixed to that document, the decision would no longer belong to committees, advisors, or circumstance. It would belong to him alone, and every consequence that followed would be his to carry, his to defend, and his to mourn. And so he sat there for several agonizing seconds, staring at the final page, reading and rereading the clauses that stripped Meghan Markle of every royal privilege she had acquired through her marriage, because the decree was not merely a bureaucratic formality. It was a crown order that redefined the official recognition of every title, honor, and ceremonial connection the Sussex household had once enjoyed, and the wording was devastatingly specific, because it removed the Duchess of Sussex styling entirely. It revoked all ceremonial privileges, it terminated palace recognition, it cancelled patronages, it erased official listings, and it permanently prohibited any future representation of the monarchy. And for Meghan, who had entered royal life as a celebrated bride, and had fought relentlessly to carve out an independent identity within an institution that had never fully embraced her, this was not just a loss of status, but the final confirmation that the family she had married into had ultimately rejected her. And what made the blow even more painful was the cruel distinction at the heart of the decree, because while Meghan's removal was absolute and final, Harry's position was described as suspended, which meant his status was frozen rather than permanently erased, and that distinction carried an unmistakable message that Charles had deliberately separated their punishments, leaving his son a narrow and conditional path back while making his wife's exclusion permanent. And Harry folded the sealed attachment that carried his name before Meghan could read it, and when she stepped closer and demanded he hand it over, his refusal created a rift between them that the palace had likely anticipated. Because by dividing their fates, Charles had not only severed the Sussex household from the monarchy, he had also planted a seed of suspicion inside their marriage, and in that moment the decree stopped being only a battle between California and the palace. It became a secret between a husband and wife, a hidden document that Harry would not share, and a question that Meghan could no longer ignore, because if Charles had offered Harry a separate settlement, a private path back, or a personal reconciliation that excluded her, then everything they had built together, everything they had sacrificed, and everything they had endured would now be tested in ways they had never anticipated. The decree did not strike Meghan and Harry in the same way, because for her it was a public humiliation, a final declaration that the institution she had challenged no longer recognized her place within it. But for him it was something far more painful, a message from his father written in the language of punishment but shaped by decades of shared history, by memories of a boy who had once walked beside his brother through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, by grief for a mother they had both lost, and by the painful recognition that the family he had rejected was still his family. And Meghan held his gaze from across the private study, but Harry could not meet her eyes because he understood that his hesitation had already told her everything she needed to know, and the hurt in her voice sharpened as she demanded to know why his position had been suspended while hers had been permanently removed, and Harry wanted to defend her from what he saw as calculated cruelty. But another fear had already taken hold, because their shared choices may have cost him his final recognized place beside his father, and the prince finally admitted that a private warning had arrived 48 hours before the signature, a confidential message delivered through a secure palace channel in which Charles had offered one last meeting and a temporary pause in the decree if his son returned to Britain alone, and the invitation was not a restoration of royal duties. It was a personal attempt to stop the break before it became permanent, but Meghan's expression changed when she realized no equivalent invitation had been sent to her, and the exclusion convinced her that the order was not simply designed to separate the Sussex brand from the crown, it was designed to separate husband from wife, leaving Harry a path back while closing hers completely, and Harry pressed a hand against the sealed attachment as though he could keep the truth contained inside it. Then he admitted the warning had referred to a specific royal moment he had deliberately hidden from Meghan, because he feared that speaking about it would lead directly to this decree, and that moment was not an argument behind palace doors. It was a public act that Charles interpreted as the final rejection of the crown itself, and every royal fracture has a moment that later appears inevitable, and in this story. That moment came during a private remembrance ceremony at St. George's Chapel, where an empty chair, an altered program, and one refused request transformed years of tension into a crisis Charles could no longer ignore. And what happened that afternoon did not remain inside the chapel. It followed the king back to Windsor and onto the decree he eventually signed, because Charles had intended that ceremony to become a quiet beginning, not another battlefield. And he invited Harry and Meghan to attend a private family remembrance service honoring the late Queen with no press appearance, no formal royal duties, and no expectation that they would stand before the public. And this remembrance service was simply a gathering held to honor someone who had died. And this one mattered because it offered the family a rare chance to meet without spectacle, with private seating and a small gathering afterward arranged so trust could begin again. But Meghan read the written conditions only minutes before the ceremony, and one request stated that the Sussexes must enter without personal photographers or independent recording staff, and she saw the restriction as another attempt to control their version of events, while palace officials viewed it as protection for a deeply personal family moment, and her frustration rose quickly because the dispute touched the very wound that had followed her for years. The question of who had the right to shape the story of her royal life, and Harry asked her to accept the condition for one afternoon, reminding her that his grandmother was being honored and that his father had made the invitation personal, not official. Yet Meghan refused to attend under rules she believed were designed to silence them, and torn between his wife and the family waiting inside, he made the decision that changed everything because he left with her. And Charles entered the chapel and immediately noticed the two empty chairs beside the aisle, and his expression remained controlled, but he quietly asked an aide whether the couple had arrived, and the advisor returned with a folded note confirming that Harry and Meghan had left the estate, and the king read it once, closed his hand around the paper, and continued without speaking. And later that evening, the damage deepened when Charles learned that a statement calling the restrictions unworkable and disrespectful had already been drafted for possible release, and while it was never published, the wording reached senior officials and was treated as proof that even a private ceremony could become another public confrontation, and Charles ordered a formal title review before midnight, a review that meant an examination of whether royal names, ranks, and privileges should continue to receive palace recognition, but still he delayed the final action, and before signing anything, the monarch summoned Harry to one last meeting with no Meghan, no lawyers, no aides, and no cameras, and that final meeting was supposed to prevent the decree. Yet the words exchanged between father and son pushed Charles closer to signing it than ever before, and there were no courtiers to soften the language and no advisors to interrupt when emotions rose. So Charles and Harry faced each other alone in a small sitting room at Windsor, divided by a table that suddenly seemed wider than an ocean, and the king wanted one clear promise, while his son wanted one final acknowledgement of the pain he believed the monarchy had caused, and neither man was prepared to surrender first. And Charles spoke carefully, but every word carried the weight of an ultimatum as he asked Harry to stop turning private royal grievances into commercial media projects, and to agree that future family conversations would remain confidential, because that promise mattered, because every leaked exchange had damaged trust inside the family and every public accusation had weakened the palace's ability to protect anyone involved, and the monarch offered something in return. He would delay the decree, preserve his son's ceremonial family connection, and begin a gradual private reconciliation without demanding an immediate return to royal duties. And a ceremonial connection meant Harry could remain recognized at important family occasions without acting as an official representative of the crown. And it was not restoration, but it was a door left open. But Harry pushed his chair back and told his father that loyalty could not be demanded, while Meghan continued to feel excluded, judged, and publicly blamed for every fracture. And his anger was not controlled now because he had spent years defending his wife, and the offer sounded to him like protection for the institution at the cost of her dignity. And Charles did not raise his voice. He answered that the monarchy could not repeatedly defend people who used their royal connection for influence while rejecting the responsibilities and boundaries attached to it. And the king's pain was clear, but so was his resolve, because he believed the crown could not survive if private family disputes were continually transformed into public leverage. And Harry then revealed the threat neither man had named, because Meghan had prepared a detailed record of their treatment, including private correspondence, meeting notes, and the names of senior household officials, and he said the material would be used if the palace attempted to erase her story, and Charles reached for a draft copy of the decree and placed it between them. And he did not threaten court action or public retaliation. Instead, he told his son that publishing private royal material would activate every clause immediately, ending the delay and making Meghan's removal permanent. And Harry stared at the document, then stood without accepting the offer, and when the door closed behind him, the monarch remained silent for several seconds before summoning an advisor, and his instruction was brief. He told them to rewrite the order so Meghan's title removal could proceed independently while his son's status remained suspended. And this decision revealed the king's final strategy, because he had separated the couple's fates, offering Harry a conditional path while closing every door for Meghan. And this was the cruelest cut of all, because it forced Harry to choose between the wife he had defended so fiercely and the family he had rejected so publicly, and Meghan. When she learned of this distinction, realized that the monarchy had not just exiled her, it had attempted to divide her marriage, and the emotional devastation of this realization was perhaps more painful than losing the title itself. The decree carried Charles's signature, but its most consequential language reflected Prince William's deepest concern, because the monarchy could not enter another reign with the Sussex conflict still attached to every decision, and the future king did not demand revenge. He demanded separation, clean, permanent, and impossible to reinterpret. And for William, this was no longer a dispute between relatives, it was a threat to the stability he would one day inherit. Because he understood that every unresolved confrontation could follow him into his own reign and overshadow Catherine's place beside him. And as heir, he could not personally remove titles, but his advice carried exceptional weight because he would eventually inherit responsibility for the crown's continuity, and the duty to keep the monarchy stable as one reign passes into the next meant that a family wound left open now could become a constitutional weakness later. And the prince reviewed the amended decree with Catherine long after the formal meetings had ended, and he moved through each clause with controlled precision until he reached the passage concerning Harry, and then he stopped, and in a private conversation later recorded in a confidential household account, he admitted that separating his brother from the monarchy felt like losing him for a second time, and Catherine did not challenge the need for boundaries, she challenged the cost. Because she asked whether public humiliation would truly create peace or simply deepen the wound until reconciliation became impossible, and her question struck at the part of William he had tried to silence, because beneath the strategy remained a brother who remembered shared grief, private promises, and a bond once thought unbreakable, and William returned to the document and removed its harshest provision, which would have erased Harry from ceremonial family records and official lists, preserving a royal person's place in family events and historic observances. And the future king supported firm separation, but he refused to let punishment rewrite his brother out of royal history, and the prince then demanded another protection, that Archie and Lilibet would not be blamed for their parents' conflict, and their private connection to Charles would remain untouched. And this clause mattered because it separated innocent children from an adult struggle, and prevented the decree from becoming a punishment passed to another generation. And Catherine supported the change, reminding him that the crown's strength would be judged not only by how firmly it acted but by whom it chose to protect. And Charles accepted both amendments when the revised order reached him, and he preserved Harry's family record and approved the safeguard for the children. Yet the king added one final restriction without changing the decree's public summary, and its wording targeted any future commercial use of Meghan's former styling, and gave the palace authority to issue an immediate correction whenever that title appeared. And the true force of that hidden restriction became clear within hours, when Meghan's team received an instruction that changed every future contract carrying her royal name, and the first consequence did not arrive from Buckingham Palace. It came through a business call, because Meghan's advisors were informed that every active project using her royal styling had to be revised immediately, while invitations, biographies, promotional materials, and charitable partnerships required new approval. And in a single morning, the title that had opened global doors became a forbidden reference, and the life built around it began to fracture, and Meghan listened as one representative carefully asked what name should appear on future materials. Because the decree now affected branding, introductions, patronage references, official biographies, and any suggestion that she still acted with royal authority, and losing those associations mattered because her title had shaped not only how she was introduced but how institutions measured her influence. And several organizations paused planned announcements while lawyers reviewed contracts carrying the Duchess of Sussex styling, and invitations were pulled back, and promotional pages were frozen. And every delayed decision sent the same message until the new rules were understood, because no company wanted to risk appearing connected to the crown without permission. And Meghan's expression hardened when the representative repeated the question, and she answered that her identity could not be rewritten by a palace document. Then she ended the call before anyone could respond, and her anger came from more than wounded pride, because the title had been part of her public life for years. And stripping it away threatened both her standing and the story she had built around surviving royal rejection. And Harry entered moments later and found her removing framed royal photographs from a shelf, and he asked her to stop, but she did not turn, and she told him the monarchy had already removed them first. And the words struck him because they reduced years of family conflict to one brutal truth, that what had once connected them to Britain had now become evidence of exclusion. And the hidden restriction arrived minutes later through a documented legal notice, stating that any continued commercial use of Meghan's former royal title would trigger a formal palace correction publicly separating the project from the crown, and that meant even a single outdated biography could invite a humiliating response watched around the world. And Harry then opened the final page concerning his own status, confirming that his position would be reviewed every year and could only be restored through direct reconciliation with Charles and a permanent promise of confidentiality. And the condition gave him a path back, but it also forced him to choose between private family repair and the public life he had built beside his wife. And Meghan surprised everyone by refusing to issue an immediate counter-statement, and she cancelled every scheduled appearance, dismissed the advisors, and asked Harry to meet her alone away from the house without publicists, lawyers, or prepared answers. And for the first time since the decree arrived, Meghan did not want a strategy meeting. She wanted the truth from the man whose future had been separated from hers, and away from advisors, legal language, and royal protocol. The crisis finally became what it had always been, a conversation between two people whose marriage had carried the weight of an international family conflict. And Meghan wanted Harry to reject the decree completely, but Harry wanted her to understand that his father had left him a narrow path home, and what followed was not a dramatic shouting match but something far more dangerous: honesty, because Harry explained that his suspended status was not an invitation to return as a working royal. It was one final chance to rebuild a private relationship with Charles while remaining outside official duties. And a working royal was a family member who carried out public engagements on behalf of the crown, and that role was not being offered back, and what remained was smaller, more fragile, and far more personal. And Meghan understood the difference immediately, because the decree placed her permanently outside the institution while leaving her husband and children connected to it through family, and that distinction mattered because it separated their futures for the first time. Because they had faced public attacks together, left royal life together, and built a new identity together, and now the palace had drawn a line through the marriage and offered Harry something it had denied her. And Meghan asked whether he intended to return to Britain without her, and her voice stayed controlled, but the hurt beneath it was impossible to hide. And Harry answered that he intended to speak to his father, yet refused to call that choice abandonment. And he told her that repairing one relationship did not mean rejecting another, though even he sounded unsure whether both could survive the journey. And the truth finally broke through when Meghan admitted that losing the title hurt less than discovering that Charles could still imagine a future with his son while no longer imagining one with her. And the public rejection was painful, but the personal exclusion cut deeper, because it confirmed that the family conflict had moved beyond negotiation and into permanent judgment. And Harry opened the sealed attachment at last, and according to the documented offer delivered through the palace, the king would meet him privately, acknowledge mistakes made within the family, and protect Archie and Lilibet's relationship with both sides. Yet the order concerning Meghan would remain unchanged, because there would be no reinstatement, no ceremonial compromise, and no future royal role. And Meghan read every line before handing the page back, and then she made the choice Harry had not expected, because she told him to attend the meeting. And for the first time, she separated his bond with his father from her own battle with the monarchy. And Harry reached for his phone, but the moment had already escaped them because the decree was public. And by the time Harry reached for the phone, the palace gates were already surrounded, and broadcasters had interrupted their schedules. And the world had chosen sides, and the decree escaped the palace before any carefully prepared explanation could contain it. And within minutes, screens across Britain carried the same breaking banner, and commentators spoke over one another, and crowds gathered outside royal residences searching for meaning in a decision that felt both historic and brutally personal. And what had begun with one signature was now a global judgment on loyalty, identity, family, and power. And broadcasters described the order as the most severe formal separation between the crown and a senior royal household in the modern era. And the scale mattered because this was no longer private disagreement. It had become an institutional break witnessed across the world. And palace officials released a short statement confirming that the decision concerned royal roles and did not alter Charles's private love for Harry, Archie, or Lilibet. But the wording was careful, and its restraint only intensified the reaction, because viewers heard affection in one sentence and final exclusion in the next. And the monarchy had drawn a boundary, yet the family remained trapped on both sides of it. And Meghan watched the coverage without speaking as commentators argued over whether she had been liberated or publicly rejected. And one panel called the decree the end of palace control, and another described it as the collapse of the identity she had carried for years. And Harry endured the debate until their children were mentioned, and then he reached for the remote and turned off the television. And Charles heard the noise from an adjoining room but refused to watch, and Camilla remained near him as voices from the broadcast carried through the closed door, and she noticed his hands trembling slightly while he folded the official statement and placed it beside untouched tea. And the Queen Consort understood that the crown had achieved clarity, but the man behind it had just watched his family fracture before the nation. And outside Buckingham Palace, the public reaction found its defining image, because a crowd gathered beneath the balcony as a newspaper seller raised a special edition above his head, and the headline read "The Final Royal Break," printed above a split image of Charles and Meghan, and some people applauded, others stood in stunned silence. The national broadcaster then delivered the sentence that cut through the argument, because in a live report, the presenter called the decree the formal death of a relationship that neither the palace nor the Sussexes knew how to repair, and Harry reopened his phone amid the chaos, and he typed 4 words and sent them directly to his father: "I will come alone." And the king read the message twice before quietly ordering that no announcement be made because the public saw exile, punishment, and royal power. Behind the palace walls, one final meeting would determine what the decree truly meant for the family left behind, and the decree achieved what years of negotiations could not, because it ended the uncertainty, and Meghan would no longer carry an active royal title, and the Sussex household would no longer operate at the edge of the monarchy, and Harry would have to choose his family relationships without the protection of ceremonial ambiguity. Yet when the documents were filed and the statements faded, no one inside the story felt victorious, because clarity had arrived but at an extraordinary human cost, and Meghan accepted that her institutional royal identity was over, and she began reorganizing future speeches, partnerships, and public projects under her personal name without royal styling or any suggestion of palace approval, and losing that styling closed one chapter of her public life, but it also removed the uncertainty that had followed every appearance and announcement. And Harry remained Charles's son, but he no longer represented the crown in any official capacity, and family reconciliation would now exist separately from royal duties, commercial projects, and public campaigns, and that boundary mattered because affection could no longer be confused with authority, and private contact could no longer be presented as institutional acceptance, and Harry entered the private Windsor meeting carrying the sealed attachment that had divided his future from Meghan's. And Charles did not withdraw the decree, and his son did not ask him to. Instead, the prince placed the document on the table and said he had come because he no longer wanted every conversation between them to become another public war. And the king answered through a recorded private exchange later, preserved in a confidential family account, and he said the decree had never been designed to erase Harry as a son. It was meant to end the dangerous confusion between belonging to the family and speaking with the authority of the crown, and the distinction protected the monarchy, but the monarch admitted that no signature could repair the emotional damage already done. And across the Atlantic, Meghan opened a prepared speech and found the final reference to her former title, and she paused before deleting it, remembering how that name had once offered status, protection, and global recognition, and then she removed it. Because what had once appeared to shield her had become a battlefield she no longer wished to carry, and Harry told his father that rebuilding their relationship would not mean returning to royal service, and Charles accepted the limit, and it was not a complete reunion, but it was the first honest foundation either man had offered in years, and William inherited a more stable institution, yet the family surrounding it had been permanently changed. And Meghan gained independence without the royal identity that shaped her position, and Harry lost institutional belonging but preserved a path to his father, and Charles protected the monarchy while accepting that power could enforce boundaries but never heal a family, and so the monarchy moved forward with clearer boundaries, and Meghan stepped into a future defined by her own name, and Harry began the painful work of rebuilding a family relationship without a royal role. And the conflict resolved not through reunion but through a final separation between love, title, and duty, because what we witnessed was not just a royal decree, it was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that had consumed the British monarchy for years. And while the institution survived and perhaps even strengthened its boundaries, the human cost was unmistakable, because a father had lost his son, a brother had lost his sibling, a wife had lost her identity, and a family had fractured in ways that might never fully heal. And the question that remains is whether this separation will bring the peace the palace desires or simply create new wounds that future generations will have to address, because the monarchy has always been about continuity, about preserving an institution that transcends any individual, and in that sense, Charles made the decision that duty demanded, but the pain of that decision will linger long after the headlines fade, long after the commentators move on to other stories, and long after the crowds outside Buckingham Palace have dispersed, because family wounds are not healed by signatures or decrees, they are healed by time, by honesty, and by the willingness of both sides to rebuild what has been broken. And whether that will ever happen between the Sussexes and the royal family remains one of the great unanswered questions of our time, because for now the door has been closed, the titles have been removed, and the separation is complete, but history has a way of surprising us, and the bonds of family, no matter how damaged, have a way of reasserting themselves when least expected, and perhaps one day when the anger has faded and the wounds have scarred, there will be room for reconciliation, but for now the monarchy has chosen clarity over comfort, and the Sussexes have been permanently exiled from the institution that once embraced them, and the world watches to see what comes next. Because this story is far from over, and the next chapter will be written not in palace decrees, but in the choices that Harry, Meghan, Charles, and William make in the years ahead, And those choices will determine not only the future of the monarchy, but also the future of a family that has been torn apart by duty, ambition, and the relentless demands of public life. And so we are left with the image of a king who signed a decree that broke his own heart. A prince who walked away from everything he was born into, and a duchess who lost the title that had come to define her. And in that image, we see the tragedy of a family that could not find its way back to each other. And we are reminded that even the most powerful institutions in the world cannot protect against the pain of fractured relationships. And that is the ultimate lesson of this story, that power and privilege are no protection against the human cost of conflict, and that the monarchy, for all its grandeur, is still a family, and families, no matter how royal, can still break.